Hey everyone, it's Kenton Becker, American Pacific Mortgage. I am here again with another weekly video tip for you. Okay, over the last few weeks, I keep saying it's a great time to buy a home, sellers are motivated, but I get a lot of questions of, well, what does that mean? What does it mean when a seller is actually motivated? How does that benefit you as a buyer? Now, obviously, the most important thing is when they are motivated, they're more willing to make a deal with you. Many times that's price reductions. A more motivated seller might be that they'll be willing to fix those things on the home. You did a home inspection and you see that there's problems. A lot of times if a seller has multiple offers on their home and now you go to them and say, hey, we want you to fix the hot water tank, or we want you to fix the furnace. They're gonna be like, they'll just say, I'm just gonna go to the next buyer and forget you. I don't wanna work with you then. So working with a motivated seller, it's gonna be a lot easier to get those negotiations done. Well, one part of negotiation up front is when you make an offer on the home, you are also able to not only tell the seller, I'm willing to pay this much for your home, but you can also ask the seller to cover closing costs. This is called seller concessions. Now, how seller concessions work is pretty simple. Let's say your closing costs were $10,000. Well, you could ask the seller to cover $10,000 of your closing costs, but you're not able to ask the seller to cover more. So if you got the seller to cover $12,000 worth of closing costs, but your closing costs were only $10,000, that would create a problem. Now there's actually $2,000 left over, and that would end up going back to the seller. So we can ask the seller to cover up to the amount of your closing costs, but not over. So when we are covering those closing costs, a big portion of the closing costs is things like appraisal fees, title and escrow fees, taxes, insurance, upfront fees like prepaid items or impounds. So that's a lot of what the closing costs are. But another portion of the closing costs is something called discount points. Discount points is to buy down your interest rate. Now this is different than the 2-1 buy down strategy. That is a separate thing because it's a temporary buy down. In other words, the 2-1 buy down that I've talked about in previous videos, it will temporarily buy down your interest rate by 2% the first year and 1% the second year. But that's only temporary. Paying discount points on your closing costs actually buy the interest rate down permanently. It will always stay that low. The downside to this though is it costs a lot more to buy that interest rate down just by a small percentage. It might cost you an extra $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 even just to buy that interest rate down 1/4% or 0.5%. So it could save you some money. Granted, it could save you $50 or $100 a month, but it's gonna cost quite a bit to get there. However, with a motivated seller in our market right now, you can negotiate to get that seller to cover those extra costs. So now that extra $5,000 it takes to buy down that interest rate, many times the seller is going to be more motivated and willing to cover that cost for you. So it doesn't come out of your pocket, it comes out of the seller's pocket to help you out with your interest rate. Now you can also combine these strategies as well. If you do run into a seller that is very motivated, they might be willing to not only cover your closing costs, maybe $10,000 or $12,000, but then on top of that, also do a 2-1 buy down. So now what you're getting is a permanently lower interest rate. Maybe that interest rate now goes from 7% to 6.5%, and then you add the 2-1 buy down onto there, and now that first year it's 4.5%, 2% lower. And then the second year, it's 5.5%, which is only 1% lower. Final third year, it goes back to your normal rate of 6.5%. Like we do predict with interest rates coming down potentially into the 6s, 5s, even 4% potentially in the next coming years, that would give you a lot of time to start making those plans and preparations to refinance your home and get those much lower interest rates that would then be a permanent change to a lower interest rate. Now, how much can the seller provide? Well, in some situations, they can provide up to 6% of the purchase price towards your closing costs. That's quite a bit of money. We're talking on a $400,000 home. We're talking on a $400,000 home, that would be $24,000. That's a lot. Probably more than what you would need to cover your closing costs. Again, generally we see closing costs usually around like 2 to 3% of the house price. So I would say the more common number that we see buyers ask the sellers to cover is around 3%. So on a $400,000 home, that would be about $12,000 to cover of the buyer's closing costs. Like I've said in the past, buying a home right now means a more motivated seller that is willing to cover your closing costs. Earlier in this year, 2022, we did not see very many sellers covering closing costs unless the buyer increased the price to motivate the seller to cover those closing costs. But we weren't seeing sellers just take a list price for their home and on top of that cover closing costs. However, right now, I'm seeing it a lot. I'm seeing sellers cover $15,000 in closing costs. I'm seeing new construction builders provide $25,000 to cover closing costs and buying the interest rate down. We can always get you a lower rate in the future with any kind of refinances or any potential out there. But we want to get a good price for the home, and we can do that with motivated sellers. That is how seller concessions work. And when we talk about motivated sellers, that is one part of it, is them paying for your closing costs with seller concessions. Thanks so much for joining me on this weekly tip. Have a great week.